Isaac Newton, a widely recognized name for many good reasons, a relentlessly curious scientific revolutionary, a brilliant mathematician and physicist who unveiled the laws of motion and universal gravitation, forever unifying the heavens and the earth, and his masterpiece, the mathematical principles of natural philosophy. His groundbreaking work not only established the foundation of classical physics, but also introduced calculus, transforming mathematical and scientific inquiry. Beyond his theoretical triumphs, he dazzled the world of optics by proving that white light is composed of a spectrum of colors, and inventing the first practical reflecting telescope, which opened new vistas for astronomical exploration. He was also the master of the royal mint, and so spearheaded crucial economic reforms, blending his scientific skill with practical public service. It is a dedication that epitomizes the essence of the scientific revolution, and so his legacy endures as a beacon of intellectual brilliance and an inspiration for generations striving to unlock the mysteries of our vast universe. Well, hopefully it's these kinds of mysteries that bring you here, a genuine curiosity. So welcome to the channel. And of course, we talk about Isaac Newton today. Hope you enjoy that. If you do, give it a like, subscribe, and leave your thoughts in the comments. You know how it is. Now, without further ado, let's begin. And so the story begins Christmas Day, December 25th, 1642, at Woolsthorpe Manor, in the village of Woolsthorpe by Colsterworth in Lincolnshire. Well, his father unfortunately passed away 3 months before his birth, and Newton was apparently born prematurely and quite small. His mother, named Hannah Ascough, is said to have remarked that she could have fit him inside a quart-sized mug. And when Newton was 3 years old, fortunately living past this premature birth and the problems that usually come with it, his mother remarried to the Reverend Barnabas Smith, and thus moved to live with him. Young Isaac was left in the care of his maternal grandmother, Marjorie Ascough. Of course, Newton felt a deep resentment towards his stepfather, and was bitter about his mother's remarriage. This is evident from a list of sins he compiled at the age of 19, which included threatening my father and mother Smith to burn them and the house over them. Yeah, that's probably considered a sin. Respect thy mother and father, all that sort of thing. Well, it wasn't just him. He also had 3 siblings from his mother's second marriage, that being Mary, Benjamin, and Hannah. So, between the ages of 12 and 17, Newton attended the King's School in Grantham, pretty prestigious, I imagine, where he studied Latin and ancient Greek, and it was there that he likely built that strong foundation in mathematics that would serve him so well. His mother, however, had different ideas. She withdrew him from the school in October 1659 and brought him back to his hometown of Woolsthorpe by Colsterworth. Why did she do this? Well, she thought it would be better if he would become a farmer, a profession which he obviously had no interest in. Well, I suppose she wasn't a fortune teller. Either way, we're very happy that he did not become a farmer. Now, Henry Stokes, the school's headmaster, was apparently so impressed with him that he persuaded his mother to let him return to his studies. Now, partly motivated by a desire to surpass a school bully, Newton became the top student, notable for constructing sundials and windmill models. In June of 1661, Newton enrolled at Trinity College, University of Cambridge. His uncle, the Reverend William Ascot, was an alumnus of Cambridge and had recommended the university to him. Now, Newton began his studies as a subsizar, meaning he performed menial tasks to pay for his education until he received a proper scholarship in 1664. This scholarship covered his expenses for another 4 years until he earned his Master of Arts degree. So, at that time, Cambridge University was, of course, still running on a more classical model. Based on this Aristotelian philosophy, but Newton also studied modern thinkers like René Descartes, who was pretty contemporary, and astronomers such as Galileo Galilei and Thomas Street. Now, he also kept a notebook entitled Questions, where he wrote down questions about mechanical philosophy as he explored the subject. In 1665, he developed the generalized binomial theorem and started to work on what would become calculus. So you have him to thank for those very difficult days in the classroom at high school. I was always terrible at mathematics. Not my subject at all. Well, shortly after receiving his Bachelor of Arts degree in August 1665, Cambridge had closed. Only temporarily, though. They were dealing with a great plague at the time, which was particularly hitting London very badly. Not a good time to be there at all. Well, as for Newton, although he was not an exceptional student at Cambridge, at least in terms of marks, well, his independent studies during the 2 years he spent back at home in Woolsthorpe led him to develop his theories on not only calculus, but on optics and the law of gravitation. So he returned to Cambridge, April of 1667. And by October of that same year, he was elected a Fellow of Trinity College. At the time, fellows were generally expected to take holy orders and become ordained Anglican priests. However, during the Restoration period, this requirement was not strictly enforced. There was still a bit of an expectation, but you weren't shoehorned into these ecclesiastical positions like you would have been in earlier times. And really all that was considered to be sufficient was a declaration of conformity to the Church of England. Well, Newton committed himself by stating, "I will set theology as the object of my studies, and take holy orders at the end of the 7 years, or else I will resign from the college." Well, up until then, he had not deeply engaged with religious studies, although he had twice affirmed the Trinity, the 39 articles rather, which formed the doctrinal foundation of the Church of England. Well, by 1675, the issue of taking holy orders could unfortunately no longer be postponed. However, Newton had developed some unorthodox religious beliefs, and this was creating an obstacle for him, not only on a personal level, but for the people who were trying to shoehorn him into these positions, that they had that expectation of him joining these holy orders, becoming a priest, whatnot. I mean, how could one really become a priest with these orthodox or unorthodox views, rather? Well, Newton's academic accomplishments were something else, and they deeply impressed one Isaac Barrow, the Lucasian professor at the time, who aimed to enhance Newton's theological and administrative skills. Barrow himself would actually become the master of Trinity College only 2 years later. Now, in 1669, just a year after receiving his master's degree, Newton succeeded Barrow as the Lucasian professor of mathematics. The terms of this prestigious position required the holder to abstain from ecclesiastical duties, likely to allow more focus on the scientific research. Now, in terms of mathematics, that was actually a very popular subject, and one of the reasons why is because it's not something that would get you in trouble with ecclesiastical authorities. And this is not just in this time of the 17th century. We're talking throughout the medieval period, anywhere from post-Roman times. Studying mathematics is generally such a dull topic that, well, you can't really run afoul of any authorities. Everyone tends to just leave these people alone. And therefore, a lot of people chose to pour their time into this intellectual chase of mathematical knowledge. Now back to Newton. Now, he argued that this exemption from these ecclesiastical duties for scientific research should actually release him from the obligation of ordination. And King Charles II, the ruler at the time whose approval was necessary, actually agreed to this reasoning. The royal consent prevented a potential conflict between Newton's personal religious beliefs and the doctrines of the Anglican Church, which were not known for being flexible or tolerant. Of course, the Anglican Church these days is a lot different to that. Now, as the Lucasian professor at Cambridge, Newton was responsible for teaching geography. In 1672, and again in 1681, he published revised and enhanced editions of General Geography, or Geographia Generalis, a geography textbook originally written in 1650, not by Newton, but by one Bernhardus Varenius. Now, what about Varenius? Well, he had sought to create a more theoretical framework that linked scientific principles with these traditional geographic concepts, a step in the right direction in terms of getting towards real geography. Now, he had viewed geography as a blend of science and pure mathematics used to describe Earth's features. Now, although it's uncertain whether Newton actually lectured on geography at all, the 1733 English translation by Dugdale and Shaw suggests that he prepared the book for students attending his lectures on the subject. Of course, Geographia Generalis is considered by some scholars to mark the transition from ancient to modern traditions in the history of geography, with Newton's involvement in its successive editions significantly contributing to its enduring importance. Of course, if you can slap the name Isaac Newton onto a book, I'm sure you can sell a few more copies. But of course, his contributions are regarded as significantly advancing every area of mathematics studied during his time. His research on what was then called fluxions, now known as calculus, is documented in a manuscript from October 1666, which is included in his collection of mathematical works. Now, there is a letter that he had wrote to John Collins in the August of 1669, who Isaac Barrow praised Newton's work, Analysis by Equations of an Infinite Number of Terms, catchy title, I know, which had been sent to Collins in June as the product of an extraordinary genius and proficiency in these matters. Later, Newton became involved in a dispute with Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz over who had first developed calculus. Apparently, there was a little bit of an argument between the two of them, but most modern historians would agree that Newton and Leibniz independently formulated calculus, but they used notably different mathematical notations. It is clear, however, that Newton developed his version earlier than Leibniz, so sorry to disappoint the Leibniz fans out there. Well, Leibniz's notation and his differential method, which are now recognized as actually more user-friendly, were adopted by continental European mathematicians and eventually British mathematicians around 1820. Now, Newton's work utilized calculus in geometric form, relying on limiting values of ratios involving infinitesimally small quantities. Now, in his seminal work, Principia Mathematica, he demonstrated this approach, referring to it as the method of first and last ratios, and explained his reasoning by noting that the same result is obtained by the method of indivisibles. Now, if you're like me, you need scientific principles explained to you like you're 5 years old. That's not to insult anyone. It's only to insult myself. So I will do that. It's all scientific jargon, and I'll try to explain it in layman's terms. Now, this method of first and last ratios can be understood through, let's say, everyday examples. Let's say you're sitting on the side of the street and you're watching a car drive by. Now, the first ratios are similar to calculating the car's average speed over a certain distance, which gives you a general idea of how fast it's moving overall. For example, if the car travels half a mile in 10 minutes, you determine its average speed by dividing the distance by the time, miles per hour, this sort of thing. But in contrast, last ratios focus on the car's exact speed at a specific moment, much like using a super fast camera to capture the car's speed at every second. Now, this allows you to see precisely how fast the car is going at any given instant, rather than just on average. Think of it kind of like a speed camera that the police use. Now, by distinguishing between these two types of measurements, Newton was able to develop the foundational concepts of calculus, enabling more accurate predictions and analysis in fields like physics, and which will become very important in the preceding centuries, engineering. Basically, the method helps us understand both the overall movement and precise changes happening at each moment, providing a comprehensive way to analyze how things change over time. I hope that all makes sense. Now, the Principia, one of his other works, has been described in modern times as a book rich with theory and application of infinitesimal calculus. And even in Newton's own era, it was observed as nearly all of it is just pure calculus. Kind of a dry book, not too fun to read. Well, his use of techniques involving one or more orders of the infinitesimally small is evident in the 1684 work on the motion of bodies in orbit. You'll often see that with its Latin title, De Motu Corporum in Gyrum, and also his earlier writings on motion from the 2 decades preceding 1684. Now, due to his concerns about potential controversy and criticism, Newton was reluctant to publish his work on calculus. Living memory of what happened to people like Galileo, no one really wanted to go down that road. You think of contemporaries like Voltaire to Galileo who, well, after reading the newspapers and seeing the fate of other philosophers, scientists, and all the rest, opted to have some of their works published posthumously. Well, in 1691, Fatio began preparing a revised edition of Newton's Principia and entered into correspondence with Leibniz. However, by 1693 their relationship had deteriorated, leading to the project's abandonment. Starting in 1669, some members of the Royal Society accused Leibniz of all-out plagiarism. The dispute intensified in 1711 when the Royal Society published a report declaring Newton as the true discoverer of calculus and labeling Leibniz as a dirty liar. Well, they didn't say dirty, but I imagine they were thinking it. Of course, it later emerged that Newton himself had written the report's concluding remarks against Leibniz. Of course, all of this ignited that bitter conflict that overshadowed both men's lives, until Leibniz finally passed away in 1716. Well, of course, Newton is well known for formulating the generalized binomial theorem, applicable by any exponent. He clarified what are now known as Newton's identities, developed Newtonian methods for finding roots, classified cubic plane curves, and made significant advancements in the theory of finite differences. He was also a pioneer in using fractional exponents and coordinate geometry to solve the Diophantine equations. Now, Newton experienced the partial sums of the harmonic series using logarithms, a technique that preceded Euler's summation method of earlier times. But of course, 1666 was his big year. He observed that when light passes through a prism at one point of minimum deviation, the resulting spectrum of colors is elongated, even though the incoming light ray is circular. Now, this indicated that the prism refracts different colors at different angles, leading him to conclude that color is an inherent property of light. Of course, at the time, this was all pretty controversial. And I know it doesn't sound very interesting, but believe me, at the time, these scientific discoveries were a pretty big deal, especially when you're looking at things like telescopes and stuff like that. It's certainly a big deal. Now, between 1670 and 1672, when lecturing on optics, Newton investigated the refraction of light. He demonstrated that the multicolored image produced by a prism, which he called a spectrum, could be recombined into white light using a lens and a second prism. Of course, modern scholarship suggests that his experiments in splitting and reconstructing white light were influenced by corpuscular theories from alchemy, alchemy being something that certainly needs a video of its own. Now, by isolating a beam of colored light and projecting it into various objects, he showed that the light's color remained consistent whether it was reflected, scattered, or transmitted. This led him to propose that colors resulted from objects interacting with pre-existing colored light, rather than objects generating color themselves, a concept known as Newton's theory of color. Now, realizing that lenses in refracting telescopes disperse light into colors, causing chromatic aberration, Newton set out to find a solution. He constructed a telescope using a reflecting mirror instead of a lens to eliminate this problem, building the first known working reflector telescope, which is now called a Newtonian telescope, requiring overcoming challenges, of course, in selecting suitable mirror materials and shaping techniques. Newton crafted his own mirrors from a special alloy of highly reflective speculum metal and used a phenomenon known as Newton's rings to test their optical quality. By late 1668, he had successfully built his first reflecting telescope, a great achievement, which was about 8 inches long and provided clearer, more magnified images. In 1671, the Royal Society requested a demonstration of his telescope. Their interest prompted him to publish his notes titled Of Colors, which he later expanded into his major work, Opticks. Now, when Robert Hooke, another scientist at the time, criticized aspects of Newton's theories, Newton was so offended by this that he withdrew from public debate. In 1679 to 1680, Hooke, acting on behalf of the Royal Society, initiated a brief correspondence to encourage Newton to contribute to their proceedings. Of course, this interaction motivated Newton to develop proof showing that planetary orbits are elliptical due to a centripetal force inversely proportional to the square of the distance. But despite this, despite Hooke coming crawling back, their relationship was strained until Hooke eventually passed away. Now, in his 1675 work Hypothesis of Light, Newton proposed the existence of an ether to facilitate the transmission of forces between particles. His interactions with Henry More, a Cambridge Platonist philosopher, reignited his interest in the old study of alchemy. Now, Newton replaced the concept of ether with mystical forces derived from the Hermetic ideas about attraction and repulsion between particles. Economist John Maynard Keynes, who possessed many of Newton's alchemical writings, famously said that Newton was not the first of the age of reason. He was the last of the age of magicians. Well, the age of magicians. That was an age that disappeared quickly. Now, Newton's scientific achievements are deeply intertwined with this fascination for alchemy, a time when the lines between science and alchemy were quite blurred. Now, in 1704, jumping forward a bit, we have the publication of Opticks, where he detailed his particle theory of light. Now, he suggested that light consists of extremely fine corpuscles, while regular matter is composed of larger ones. He even speculated about the possibility of alchemical transmutation. That's right, even like 20, 30 years later, he's not grown out of the alchemy yet. So he speculated on it, saying, are not gross bodies of light convertible into one another, and may not bodies receive much of their activity from the particles of life which enter their composition? Additionally, he invented a basic form of frictional electrostatic generator, which, yes, is very ahead of its time. The invention of a basic frictional electrostatic generator using a glass globe was kind of this early attempt to create and study static electricity. I'm sure you've seen the old science experiment with the big globe, when we have things like depictions of Nikola Tesla's laboratory. Imagine a glass bowl that you rub with a cloth, and this rubbing action transfers tiny charged particles called electrons between the materials. As a result, the glass globe becomes electrically charged, either positively or negatively, and a charge can attract small objects or create tiny sparks, which of course demonstrates the presence of electricity. Whether they were entirely sure about what they were dealing with back then, well, that remains to be debated. Now, in optics, he was the first to present a diagram using a prism as a beam expander and demonstrated the application of multiple prism arrays. Nearly 278 years after his work, multiple prism beam expanders have become crucial in developing narrow line-width tunable lasers, leading to multiple prism dispersion theory. Well, Newton started developing his theory of gravity as early as 1665, but jumping forward to 1679, he returned to studying celestial mechanics, focusing on how gravity affects planetary objects in relation to Kepler's laws of planetary motion. This renewed interest followed a brief correspondence with Robert Hooke, the new secretary of the Royal Society, who encouraged Newton to contribute to the Society's work. Observing a comet in the winter of 1680-81 further spurred his interest, a practical use for his theories, leading of course to communications with the astronomer John Flamsteed. Building on discussions with Hooke, Newton formulated a proof showing that elliptical orbits of planets resulted from a centripetal force inversely proportional to the square of the distance from the center. He shared his findings with Edmund Halley and the Royal Society in a paper called On the Motion of Bodies in Orbit, about 9 pages long, which was recorded in the Royal Society's Register book in December of 1684. This work contained the foundational ideas that Newton later expanded into his landmark book, the Principia, or the philosophy of the natural principles of mathematics. We mainly just call it Principia, though. Now, published in July 5th of 1687, with financial support and encouragement from Halley, the Principia laid out Newton's 3 laws of motion. These laws describe the relationship between an object, the forces acting upon it, and its resulting motion, forming the basis of what we know as classical mechanics. They enabled numerous advancements during the Industrial Revolution and remained unchallenged for almost 2 centuries. Many of these principles continue to underpin the foundations of technologies that do not require these relativistic corrections even to our modern day. Of course, Newton used the term gravitas, meaning weight, to describe what we now call gravity, and formulated the law of universal gravitation. Now, we still use this term gravitas in political context. I believe that there's perhaps a journalist corporation called Gravitas. Something like that, I'm not too sure. Now, in the same work, Newton introduced a calculus-like approach to geometrical analysis, utilizing that first and last ratios that we've discussed, providing an inaugural analytical calculation of the velocity of sound in air, deduced the oblateness of Earth's spherical shape, explained the precision of equinoxes due to the moon's gravitational influence on Earth, and commenced the gravitational examination of the moon's motion irregularities, also offering a theory for calculating cometary orbits, among other contributions. Now, Newton's biographer, David Brewster, documented that the intricacy of applying his gravitational theory to lunar motion significantly impacted Newton's health, stating that he was deprived of his appetite and sleep. Brewster states that Edmund Halley informed John Conduit that when urged to finalize his study, Newton consistently remarked that about his headaches and frequently disrupted sleep schedule, and eventually he just abandoned the matter entirely. Can't blame him. One must prioritize their health, of course. Now, Newton faced criticism for incorporating occult agencies into science due to his hypothesis of an invisible force capable of exerting influence over extensive distances. In the second edition of the Principia in 1713, he decisively dismissed these criticisms in a concluding general scholium, asserting that it sufficed that the phenomena suggested gravitational attraction, which they did. However, they did not elucidate its cause, and it was both unnecessary and inappropriate to formulate hypotheses regarding matters not indicated by the phenomena. Now, through the Principia, Newton attained international recognition. He garnered a following of fans in the scientific community, among whom was the Swiss-born mathematician Nicolas Fatio de Dulier. In 1710, Newton identified 72 of the 78 species, as he called them, of cubic curves, and classified them into 4 categories. 7 years later, in 1717, likely with Newton's assistance, James Stirling demonstrated that every cubic belonged to one of these 4 categories. Newton asserted that 4 types could be derived through plane projection from a singular type, a proposition substantiated in 1731, 4 years after he had passed away. Oh, sorry, spoiler alert, he dies at the end. But before that, in 1696, during the reign of King William III, Newton relocated to London to assume the role of Warden of the Royal Mint, a position secured by the patronage of Charles Montague, 1st Earl of Halifax, who was at that time the Chancellor of the Exchequer. He assumed responsibilities for England's significant recoining, encroached upon the authority of Lord Lucas, Governor of the Tower, and obtained the position of Deputy Controller for the temporary Chester branch on behalf of Edmund Halley. Newton ascended to the prominent position of Master of the Mint following Thomas Neale's death in 1699, a role he maintained for the subsequent 30 years of his life. Pretty stable career. One wouldn't turn it down. Just wonder if he had had a little bit more time for scientific endeavors, what else he would have come up with. Who knows? Well, these postings were designated as sinecures, however. Newton did approach them with the earnestness that they deserved. He concluded his responsibilities at Cambridge in 1701 and utilized his power to amend the money and penalize clippers and counterfeiters. Now, what are clippers? Well, the edges of the coins used to be able to clip the sides off them and take a little bit of gold or silver for yourself. Certain groups of people have been kicked out of these countries for being accused of doing such things in the past. It was pretty much everybody who was getting in on the clipping action. And this is why a lot of our coins these days have the lines on the side going down as little indentations, because people kept clipping them off. Now, as warden, and then as master of the Royal Mint, Newton assessed that 20% of the coins received during the Great Recoinage of 1696 were actually fraudulent. And of course, counterfeiting, well, that constituted high treason, and if they caught you, you would be hanged, disemboweled, and quartered. Seems a little excessive. Notwithstanding this, securing convictions against even the most egregious offenders could be very challenging. Yet Newton showed his capability in this endeavor. You see, concealed as a regular patron of bars and taverns, he collected a significant portion of that material alone. Despite the obstacles to prosecution and the separation of governmental branches, English law retained ancient and formidable practices of authority. Newton was appointed a justice of the peace in all the home counties. A draft letter concerning the issue is contained among Newton's personal first edition of the Principia, which was likely being revisited at the time, or revised rather. Subsequently, he executed over 100 cross-examinations of witnesses, informants, and suspects from June of 1698 until Christmas of 1699, and he effectively prosecuted 28 counterfeiters. Now in 1703, he was appointed president of the Royal Society and became an associate of the French Academy of Science. In his role at the Royal Society, Newton antagonized John Flamsteed, the Astronomer Royal, by hastily releasing Flamsteed's Historia Coelestis Britannica, which Newton had utilized in his research. Of course, Flamsteed was not too impressed with this. In April of 1705, Queen Anne conferred knighthood upon Newton during a royal visit to Trinity College in Cambridge. The knighthood was presumably driven by political factors related to the legislative election in May of 1705 rather than acknowledgement of Newton's scientific contributions, or even his role as master of the mint, stopping those dirty little clippers and counterfeiters. Newton was the second scientist to receive a knighthood. Do you know who the first one is? Think about it. It was Sir Francis Bacon. If you had watched my video on Francis Bacon, you would have known that. Now, following a report authored by Newton on the 21st of September 1717 to the Lords Commissioner of the Majesty's Treasury, the bimetallic ratio between gold and silver coins was altered by royal proclamation on the 22nd of December 1717, prohibiting the exchange of gold guineas for more than 21 silver shillings. Now, this unintentionally caused a scarcity of silver, as coins were utilized for import payments, while exports were settled in gold, so transitioning Britain from the silver standard to its inaugural gold standard. The intention behind his actions remains a little bit of a subject of discussion, not one for this video. Now, it has been suggested that Newton regarded his endeavors at the mint as an extension of alchemical pursuits. In the latter part of his life, Newton resided at Cranberry Park near Winchester with his niece and her spouse. Catherine Barton, his half-niece, acted as his hostess for social events at his residence on Jermyn Street in London. He referred to himself as her very loving uncle in a letter during her recovery from smallpox. And speaking of diseases and death, Newton passed away, but not of anything bad. He got lucky. He died in his sleep, in his bed, 20th of March, 1727. He received a ceremonial funeral, of course. Friends in high places will get you that, attended by nobility, scientists, and philosophers, and was interred at Westminster Abbey, alongside monarchs. Now that's some prime real estate. He was the inaugural scientist interred in the Abbey. Now, Voltaire actually might have attended his funeral, but we're not too sure. He was around at the time. Now, as a bachelor, he had bequeathed a significant portion of his assets to his relatives in his final years and passed away interstate. His documents were transferred to John Conduit and Catherine Barton, who kept them thereafter. Despite claims he was once engaged, Isaac Newton never married. And Voltaire said, who was in London at the time during his funeral, that he was never sensible to any passion, was not subject to the common frailties of mankind, nor had any commerce with women, a circumstance which was assured to me by the physician or surgeon who attended him in his last moments. In a later memoir, Newton reflected, "I do not know what I may appear to the world, but to myself I seem to have been only like a boy playing on the seashore, and diverting myself in now and then finding a smoother pebble or a prettier shell than the ordinary, whilst the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before me." Okay, thank you very much for listening. Did you have fun learning about your boy Isaac Newton? It's good fun, isn't it? Interesting. He certainly knew how to have a lot of rivalries with people, although it's always a race to discover things before other people in the scientific world. Now, I'm going to thank my top-tier patrons, supporters, Dark, Kerry, Kimberly, Ember, Ben, Britt, Charles, Aaron, James, Jeffrey, Melissa, Scott, Stark Factory, Wendy, Jaden, Sherry, Jessica, Christine, Sally, Katiana, Christine, Fizabo, Legitmus, Maverick, Susan, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Cameron, Alexander, Nicholas, Daniel, and JR. Thank you very much for joining me, and I'm sure I can count on you to be back here next time to learn even more about the fascinating past. Ooh, very nice. Good night, everybody. As always, lots of love to you all, dearest regards, and the fondest of good nights.